Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and I got a few things over here on the bench ready to go. It's my pre-made bedding supply. It's shredded cardboard, shredded paper, some leaves mixed in with some moisture. Nothing too fancy. At one point a while back I threw some finished castings into the box. Try to introduce some microbial life into here too, a little fungi, a little bacteria, whatever. All those beneficial things that help with the breakdown process. I also have some material here, which is crushed eggshell. If you're into worm farming, you're going to need to use some sort of a grit usually. Some people say it's not that important, but if you got it, what the heck, might as well include it. It's pulverized eggshell. It's that gritty substance that the worms need down within their gizzards to digest their foods. I got all these things here on standby, ready to work on one of my bins. I just don't have the food here yet because my last encounter with this bin was 2 weeks ago now, at which point I felt like I was kind of feeding a system that still had plenty of leftovers. I don't know what to expect today, so figured I'd go a little bit more cautiously into today's feeding just by checking the system out, bringing it up here on the bench, seeing if it even needs food. If not, we'll let it go a little longer, but if it needs food, then I can run upstairs and get something to give it. It's the bin right over here. It's the container of many names. It's the original population of red wigglers that I kind of saved from oblivion, basically. It's a population of worms that at one point I had built up to many thousands, and it had dwindled down to, after many die-offs, down to virtually nothing. But I managed to find a few survivors and kind of nurture them back to health, and what's in here is the result of that work. So I'm going to get a glove on. We're going to see how things are doing in this bin. It's 125 days old at this point and has received 11 feedings so far. If it needs another 12th feeding today, we'll give it what it needs. So let's get to work. So before we continue, just a quick circle back to something I said earlier. This system's 125 days old at this point. And I had flashed my big box of pre-made bedding that I thought we might use today. But then it just sort of occurred to me that usually in my more mature bins, such as this one, I would typically not want to add any more bedding. Oh, look at this little guy. Alright, I just got back. I stepped away just for a moment. I heard the doorbell ring. So I didn't even take my glove off or anything. I just shot upstairs to see if somebody was waiting at the door. There is a there is an Amazon delivery out there. But I didn't bother bringing it in. I figured let's just get this feeding underway. Man, this paper is really fragile. I bumped into it in a couple spots and it just ripped. And that kind of makes sense since it's been sitting underneath that piece of plastic, under that bubble wrap for all this while. Subject to recirculating moisture that plastic captures. And I think all these castings that are on here, I mean some of them are still adhering to the paper, but you can kind of get a sense of how many castings have piled up here on this piece of paper over the past couple weeks. So they're hanging out on the top surface, coming up to meet and greet, and sometimes out here you'll even find a cocoon or two. I just wonder if we can very gingerly handle this piece of paper and possibly preserve it for yet another go around of serving as top covering. Oh no. It just tears under its own weight. Perhaps it's time to use that piece of paper as just bedding and swap it out for a replacement. Yeah, you know, wow, this piece is so fragile too. I do feel like my adoption of using a lot of bedding lots of bedding all the time basically when practical to do so, has resulted in me getting systems that just have a greater amount of volume after a given amount of time. Just because, you know, I used to just throw food in, maybe a hint of bedding. Nowadays, bedding is almost as important an ingredient to my feedings as the food is. Just resulting in a lot more mass, helping me get to that point where I'm pretty much full in the bin quicker. So a 15th feeding in my wormery often translates into being the last feeding a bin gets before we try to initiate it towards getting wound up and finished off and harvested. So I have no reason to think that this system should be any different. I mean, there was a period of time when the system had an extremely small population, so I would have probably not expected a great deal from it, but I think that over time it has managed to bounce back, you know. So I think a lot of the worms in here are ones that were actually born in the past few months. Because there were points in time when I really thought that this entire population within this bin amounted to no more than just a couple dozen worms. I'm fairly certain that we've got a lot more than that going on here nowadays. So besides reusing that top covering paper, I thought we might be able to also gather up a lot of this large chunk material floating around out here on the surface. Some of it a little bit dry because it was near the edge here. I'm going to try to help that stuff get to a place where there's a lot more activity. We'll include it with the feeding, if we're feeding today, where it'll get a plenty of moisture and plenty of attention from the worms. So the one thing that I was suspecting to still see leftovers of is the apple peels. Apple peels were placed in here when we last checked in 14 days ago. And I believe that that's what we're seeing leftovers of in here already. The other stuff that was put in here is probably gone by now. There was stuff like chunks of cauliflower. There were carrot peels, I believe. I think there were some green beans even. So the apple peels were not the only thing fed last time we were in here, but I believe they were one of the only items in that feeding that were kind of slow composting items. I believe from feedings prior to 2 weeks ago, prior to our last check-in here, there had also been an application of some apple peels. So there was like 2 consecutive applications of apple peels in this bin over the last couple check-ins, and I don't think I've even got any apple peels at this time. So we'll just sort of go with the potluck approach that I usually use when I feed my bins. I just go up to my little collection of frozen stuff that I set aside, kitchen scraps, and whatever's on top is what I give them. Man, this worm is fat. Got a good, healthy, big old worm there. And a lot of these guys are, I mean, that guy's maybe not quite as large. Just had like a nice girth to it. Nice chunky worm. This guy too, kind of peeking his head out. Whoa. Where's his tail? It's a good sized worm, you know? So I assume that I've got red wigglers here, but I've had some interesting occasions recently where I've had worms try to bug out of the systems that they were living in, and they might have eventually plopped down into a lower bin that was on a shelf beneath where they were living. I think I had some European night crawlers, or no, I had some African night crawlers exhibit that kind of behavior. I also had like a mixed batch of worms, which includes blue worms and red wigglers and European night crawlers. I had some of those worms kind of freak out on me once after kind of a rough check-in. Was kind of handling them pretty roughly, kind of like what I'm doing here, being pretty rough. So if these are still mainly red wigglers typically tolerate that sort of handling, but other types of worms aren't quite as easygoing about that. So man, I created a much larger hole down here than I think we need. I don't know why. I think I just sort of zoned out there chit-chatting. I think I was also sort of taken by surprise at how many worms I saw in here. You know, everywhere I look, there's worms. You know, and if you've been with me for a while, if you were here in the early days of this container, when we were really just sort of trying to get this thing to limp back onto its feet, we would occasionally actually go looking through the bin, trying to figure out how many worms do we actually have, and pick through the material quite thoroughly, only to find a handful of worms, if we were lucky. Sometimes we found very few, you know, so the numbers went up and down. A lot of it might have just been attributable to my skill or luck or whatever. So at times I really did worry about this system possibly not making it, but I think we're out of the woods. So I took all that stuff we collected in the beginning, all that loose stuff, some of it dry, and I figured I would use that as our bedding, since I'm not going to put fresh bedding in here. I like that idea of trying to help a system drive towards completion by not putting any more bedding in or any more slow composting materials. So I think today we're going to do what we're probably going to do from this point forward up until such a time that it's time to harvest, that we'll feed only with food, throw in some grit. Moisture is not necessary here because things are really nice and damp and comfortable. But I've got to go to the kitchen, so I'm going to go get some stuff to feed these little guys with, and I'll be right back. The big bag contains cucumber and just a couple tiny little pieces of tomato. These unusual purple things are the ice cubes I made from the juice that spilled out of a bunch of berries that I fed to some of my worms recently. The juice just would have been way too much, would have swamped the worm bin that I ended up putting those berries into. I had lots and lots of that, so I just figured I'd start getting rid of that. And coffee, a couple days worth of coffee. So, you know, in keeping with what I said earlier, I'd really prefer just to keep paper out of the container at this point. And although I was thinking about maybe just using them as sort of the replacement top coverings, because as you'll remember, those pieces of newspaper as well as the coffee filter that we removed from the top here were so tattered. Maybe we'll break our rule and let this bin have one final dose of bedding that really heavily worked. Coffee filter, whoa, just under its own weight it's tearing already. But luckily it all came over before it decided to self-destruct. So it's not going to take much for the worms to finish the job on this piece of paper here. It's already pretty close to that point of being almost completely broken down, and then there was that newspaper too, right? So let's not forget to put this in here. But I figured I would layer things. We've already got a good amount of recycled bedding bits off the surface, as well as one coffee filter. I'd like to start laying in the food and get it in here in layers. So we'll start with some of the coffee, since we've got an abundant quantity of it. We'll drop one filter's worth in. See if we can kind of help it combine with some of the stuff surrounding it, and also break up any of the larger chunks I see. Trying to make the stuff as approachable as possible. And even with this grit, you know, we pulled away from using the fresh bedding supply. The grit for feeding like this, which consists of stuff that the worms probably don't even need grit for to digest it, I'm just putting it in at this point to pretty much do away with it. So these delicious berry bits, you know, I figure I put those on the top, you know, because as they can thaw, they can kind of emit their moisture and soak down into the things below them, rather than being low already and just ending up as puddles on the bottom. Figure they might serve a better function up top, probably over on top of the recycled newspaper. That'll give it some nice material to absorb into. Got some nice chunks of cucumber here, not just the peels, but some pretty good size sections from the ends. So that's a pretty nice combination of stuff. Well, we're starting to run low on things here, so I guess we'll just pile in the remainder of the coffee that's in the other filter. So we got something to put it on top of, rather than just putting it on top of more coffee. To me, it just somehow seems like coffee's got a better chance of breaking down if it's mixed with other stuff. Worms just, in my bins at least, don't seem to crowd around a big mound of coffee that's just sitting there. It seems like they'll go for pretty much everything else first and treat that as a last resort in a way. Maybe I'm just using coffee that worms don't like that much, but I've been trying to see what I could do to help increase interest in the coffee, used coffee that I sprinkle down into my worm bins nowadays. So I'm thinking let's deplete the remainder of the veggie scraps. Here's another pretty good chunk of cucumber. The other two big chunks were out on the outer edges. Let's throw this one smack in the middle. And like I said earlier, even though we probably don't need it here, putting the grid in anyway. So before we put those little ice cubes in here with the berry juice, let's see if I could spread this out a little bit. So I've got something to put all those cubes on top of, something that'll maybe suck in those drips of yummy, delicious, fruity moisture and sort of boost up the appeal of the paper. Even though worms already kind of have a need to consume more carbon-rich material, and that paper fits the bill for that purpose, I figured why not sweeten the deal a little bit, right? And then we'll use these to cover up on the top now. We don't have to commission a new piece of newspaper. I think we're pretty much done here. I think in the process of covering up, I'm going to try to be a little bit careful. You know, I don't want to, I don't know, I just feel bad about maybe piling some worms right on top of these ice cubes. But, you know, if they don't like it, they could always just crawl away. I'll just try to do it in kind of a careful way, so I know I'm just hopefully putting scraps of bedding and whatnot against the ice cubes, not explicitly laying worms up against those ice cubes. I guess we're going to have a couple little sinkholes developing over here too, right? Once the once the ice melts and the fluid drips down. We got a whole bunch of leftover foods here too. It's going to be littering the top surface of this container. It's times like this I do sort of crave having a little bit more of a substantial top covering over all this stuff. So at this point I didn't really take great care in making sure that all the leftover foods that I excavated out of the feeding area were all brought back to the middle. But you know what? The stuff on the far outer edges that I'd like to inspect also before we close up here, maybe we can just use a little bit of that to sort of coat the feeding area with a little bit of stuff that's not loaded with all kinds of food scraps. And I think in the fluffing up of things here on the outer edges too, we'll be able to restore things to be pretty level. Things look really good out here. The moisture is just right. There are large chunks of kind of clumped together paper. It's something that I've since figured out how to avoid when preparing my bedding, but these I think throw back to when I was using paper that was coming out of my old shredder. It created much larger strips of paper, and you get a few of those wet and they start sticking to each other. Next thing you know, you got a big clump of paper. So I think it went from kind of pretty damp to not as damp over on this side. So I'm wondering if we can just kind of commingle this stuff a little bit and share the moisture a bit. That might be nice. So here's some leftover apple. We'll try to cover that with a handful of stuff. I don't want to have a big huge mound in the middle though. So we'll continue to try to level off a bit here. But we might be able to round up a little bit more stuff from the other side too before we close up shop. I'd like to see how things over here look as well. Here too, a lot more crumbly. Perhaps a little bit drier than it needs to be, but still shows signs of worm activity. Lots of nice castings, so I don't think anything in this bin really requires any attention in terms of being remedied or corrected. Everything in here seems really nice. Maybe the only gotcha are these little clumps of bedding that could probably do with a little bit of breaking up every now and then if you encounter one, and that's exactly what I'll do when I bump into one. See if I can kind of turn it into many little small fragments of paper rather than allowing it to remain as just a big lump. If there's a big lump, it ain't going to go anywhere. But, you know, we've still got time, you know. I mean, there's time for this stuff to eventually break down, and hopefully for us to encounter it again in future check-ins so we can further help it along if we need to. But I think we're pretty much at the end here. The system's doing quite nicely. Certainly no reason anymore to consider it as like a system that's somehow deficient or handicapped or anything. I feel like it's just another bin, and it certainly seems to have the numbers to live up to that as well. So I really feel like we've done a great job helping this system bounce back. And I don't know, maybe a couple more feedings. It might be time to start, gearing up to migrate these wormies out of their finished compost, which is at this point still just almost finished compost, but it's definitely getting there. So I look forward to maybe using this population to launch off not just one new system, hopefully a couple new systems, to see if I can sort of spread their numbers around and see if I can bring back the original population using specimens from the original bunch. So I'm just going to spread this stuff out a little bit. This is kind of showing us where we fed the little guys, pretty much down the middle. It's also kind of to protect the plastic a little bit. I don't know. It doesn't really matter, right? It would probably be just the same if I were to just take this plastic and drop it straight onto the castings. I just somehow prefer having a little something in between. Alright, very cool, very cool. Well, let's get this thing covered up and back up on the shelf, because we're done here. So, before I resume the rest of the stuff that's got to get done, such as putting things away and cleaning them up, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day.